The wash was still pinned to the line, snapping in the warm May wind, when Ruth Bennett came around the corner of the house and found the playpen empty. It was a Tuesday afternoon in 1978 in the timber town of Hazel Ridge, Oregon, a place tucked so deep in the folds of the Coast Range that the fog didn't burn off some mornings until noon. Ruth had stepped inside for no more than 5 minutes to answer the phone. When she walked back out, her 1-year-old daughter, Aria, was gone from the shaded playpen on the porch, and the only thing left behind was a single yellow knitted bootie lying in the grass by the front gate. There was no creek to blame, no place a baby could crawl to. A 1-year-old does not wander off and vanish from a fenced yard in the time it takes to answer a telephone. Someone had reached in and lifted her out. It would take 47 years, a science that did not exist in 1978, and a woman in another state who spat into a plastic tube out of simple curiosity to finally answer the question Ruth Bennett would spend the rest of her life asking. But to understand how a stolen baby comes home nearly half a century later, you first have to understand the town she was taken from, and the family that never stopped listening for her at the gate. In 1978, Hazel Ridge ran on timber and trust in equal measure. The mill on the edge of town employed nearly every father in the valley, and the whole place kept the mill's rhythm, the early whistle, the smell of fresh-cut fir and wood smoke hanging in the damp air, the low grind of log trucks working the switchbacks down from the ridge. It was a town of maybe 600 people, where the doors stayed unlocked and the children ran loose from breakfast to supper, and the neighbors watched one another's kids without being asked. Ruth and Walt Bennett had lived there their whole lives. Walt worked the green chain at the mill, and Ruth kept the house and raised the children, and by every account, they were an ordinary, happy family in an ordinary, happy town. There were 2 Bennett children. Danny was 8 that spring, a serious, watchful boy who was already old enough to help, old enough to carry his baby sister on his hip while their mother cooked, old enough to be trusted to watch the road. In the evenings, the family gathered around a console television in the front room, and Walt kept a CB radio crackling in the kitchen to hear the mill news, and their station wagon sat in the gravel drive with a cracked vinyl seat that burned in the summer sun. It was that kind of decade, in that kind of town. And then there was the baby. Aria Bennett had been born the previous April, a late and unexpected blessing, and she was the delight of the whole household. Records and later interviews describe a placid, bright-eyed baby with a head full of dark curls, just learning to pull herself up on the furniture, forever losing her socks and her booties because she kicked them off the moment anyone put them on. Ruth had knitted her a pair in soft yellow yarn that winter, and Aria kicked those off too, so that Ruth was forever finding one under the couch, one behind a chair leg. On the afternoon everything changed. Aria was wearing exactly one of them. The other was already lost somewhere in the house. That detail would haunt Ruth for the rest of her life, that she never even got to dress her daughter in both. It was an ordinary spring afternoon in a town that had never given anyone a reason to be afraid. In the next 5 minutes, none of it would ever be ordinary again. That Tuesday, Ruth had hung the wash on the line in the side yard while Aria napped in the playpen on the porch, in the shade, where Ruth could see her through the kitchen window. It was warm. A neighbor's radio drifted over the fence. When the phone rang inside, Ruth propped the screen door open, took the call, and kept half an eye on the porch the way any mother would. The call lasted 4, maybe 5 minutes. When she stepped back out onto the porch, the playpen blanket was thrown back, and the playpen was empty. At first, she thought Walt had come home early and scooped the baby up. She called his name into the house, Silence. She checked every room. She checked under the porch, in the truck, along the fence line, her voice climbing higher each time she called Aria's name. And then, near the front gate, half in the grass, she saw the little yellow booty. Just one, off the baby's foot. It sat there in the sun as if it had been dropped by someone in a hurry. Ruth looked at it and understood, in the way a body understands before the mind will allow it, that Aria had not crawled anywhere. Someone had carried her out. Someone had passed through that gate with her daughter in their arms. Ruth Bennett started to scream, and she did not stop until the neighbors came running. The Bennett's disappearance landed with a county sheriff's office that had never handled anything like it. In 1978, there was no national system for missing children, no database, no hotline, no age progression, none of the infrastructure that Americans now take for granted, because none of it would exist until the 1980s. A missing baby in a small Oregon timber town in 1978 fell into a void. The deputy who caught the case, a decent but overmatched man named Owen Radley, did what small departments did then. He organized searches of the woods behind the house. He put out a description on the radio. And then, unable to imagine that a stranger could simply walk into a town like Hazel Ridge and carry off a sleeping baby in broad daylight, the investigation made the decision that would cost Aria Bennett the best chance she ever had of coming home quickly. It turned inward. It began to look at the parents. For the crucial first weeks, the only weeks that mattered, deputies questioned Ruth and Walt again and again. They searched the property. They asked the neighbors pointed questions about the Bennett's marriage, about Ruth's state of mind, about whether a young mother might have snapped. It was not malice. It was a failure of imagination, the inability of a small department to believe the truth in front of them. And it meant that while investigators dug through the Bennett's lives, the person who actually took Aria was driving farther and farther away with every hour. By the time suspicion finally lifted from Ruth and Walt, weeks had passed. There was a single real lead, a drifter. A man seen walking the highway shoulder near the mill road the morning Aria vanished. Someone no one in town recognized. For a few days, he was everything. Deputies chased the description north toward Portland and south toward the coast, and for a little while Ruth let herself believe an arrest was coming. Then the man was found, a harmless transient 2 counties over who had been nowhere near the Bennett property, cleared in an afternoon. He was the first dead end, and he taught Ruth what the next 4 decades would confirm, that hope in this case would arrive often and leave just as fast. After him, there was nothing. He was never replaced by another suspect. The trail, such as it was, simply ended. And while the official case circled the parents and then went cold, Ruth Bennett began the other search, the one that would last the rest of her life. She wrote letters to hospitals and churches across 3 states. She kept a scrapbook of every baby girl found abandoned or turned up in adoption notices, comparing dates and ages, her hope and her dread bound together in the same pages. She left the porch light on. Walt would tell her, gently, that she had to stop. She never did. By 1985, 7 years had passed, and Hazel Ridge had learned to live around the wound the way a tree grows around a nail. The mill kept its rhythm. Children grew up and moved to the cities for work, but the Bennett house never healed. Walt Bennett was never the same after those weeks of being treated as a suspect in his own daughter's disappearance, and the marriage bent under the weight of it for years before it finally broke. Walt died in 1994, a quiet man who had gone hollow long before. Danny grew up in a house organized entirely around an absence, a boy who learned early to be careful and small, so as not to add to his mother's grief. He left for the coast as a young man, but he always came back, because he could not leave Ruth alone with it. The nursery had been meant to become a proper bedroom for a growing girl. Instead, Ruth kept the crib assembled for years, then finally took it down, but never repainted the room. So the small pencil marks where Walt had planned to hang a shelf stayed on the wall for decades. The mill that had employed half the town shut its doors in the 90s, and the young families moved away, and the searchers who had once walked the woods behind the house grew old and died. And still the case sat exactly where it had stopped in 1978. And Ruth searched. That was the thing everyone who knew her remembered. She never once used the word most people used quietly about Aria. She kept the single yellow booty in a small box on her dresser for 47 years, and every May, on the anniversary, she took it out and held it. When the National Missing Children Center finally opened in the 1980s, Ruth was one of the first mothers in the county to send in her daughter's information. Decades old and heartbreakingly thin. One photograph, one date, one description of a baby who by then would have been grown. She did Dina when Dina became a thing families could do, swabbing her cheek and mailing it off and waiting. She grew old at the same kitchen window she'd been standing at when the phone rang. And in 2019, at the age of 88, Ruth Bennett died, still not knowing, with the yellow booty in the box beside her bed. She had searched for her daughter for more than 4 decades, and she died 6 years short of the answer. The yellow booty in its box on the nightstand beside her. If a story like Ruth's stays with you, a mother who refused to stop, a family that carried an absence for decades, take a moment to subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The cases we tell are real lives and real grief, and the time we can give them depends entirely on you. Now, let's get back to Aria. The case had been cold for 47 years when it broke, and it broke because of a decision Ruth's son had made a decade before, and a birthday gift a stranger almost threw away. Years earlier, Danny Bennett had uploaded his own Dina to a public genealogy database, the way thousands of relatives of the missing quietly do, hoping without much hope that someday somewhere a match would surface. Then, in the spring of 2025, in a suburb of Sacramento, California, a 48-year-old woman named Diane Merrick opened a home ancestry kit her daughter had given her for her birthday. Diane had been raised as an only child by a loving couple, Frank and Eleanor Merrick, both gone now, in a comfortable and ordinary California home. She had always known she was adopted. Her parents had never hidden it, and she had never felt the need to go looking. She almost set the kit in a drawer. But her daughter kept asking, so Diane spit in the tube and mailed it off, and forgot about it. 6 weeks later, the results came, and near the top of her list of Dina relatives was a match the site labeled with 2 devastating words. Full sibling, a brother in Oregon named Danny Bennett. Diane had no brother. She stared at the screen and felt her whole understanding of herself go quietly loose. She sent a careful message. And a 55-year-old man in Oregon, who had uploaded his NA years earlier and long since stopped expecting anything, opened it and had to sit down. Danny knew what a full sibling match to a woman his sister's age could mean. He did not let himself believe it. He called the Oregon State Police Cold Case Unit, and the case landed with Detective Grace Okafor, who pulled a brittle 1978 file with a single photograph of a dark-haired baby clipped inside. Okafor explained the science to Danny plainly, the way these things have to be explained. Genetic genealogy compares a person's Dina against the millions of ordinary people who've uploaded their own. And where enough DNA is shared, the relationship isn't a guess, it's arithmetic. A full sibling match is one of the strongest signals there is. But arithmetic wasn't proof, so Okafor arranged a confirmatory test against the DNA Ruth Bennett had left in the state system before she died. Ruth had swabbed her cheek years earlier and mailed it off and never gotten an answer in her lifetime. Now that sample, waiting quietly in a database, would give her the answer at last. 11 days later, the lab called Okafor with a number. A greater than 99.99% probability that Diane Merrick of Sacramento was the biological daughter of Ruth Bennett of Hazel Ridge. Okafor read the report twice before she called Danny. When she told him, there was a long silence on the line, and then a sound she had heard from families before. Not quite crying, something older than that. The sound of a person setting down a weight they have carried so long, they've forgotten what standing up straight feels like. Diane Merrick was Aria Bennett. She had been alive the entire time. But the match opened a harder question than it closed. If Aria had been stolen from a porch in 1978, then how had she ended up as an infant in the arms of a loving California couple who raised her for a lifetime? The answer, when investigators traced it back, revealed something worse than a single kidnapper. It revealed a business. Frank and Eleanor Merrick had adopted their daughter in 1978 through what they believed was a private, legal arrangement, handled by a soft-spoken woman who presented herself as an independent adoption facilitator, a woman named Vivian Marsh. The Merricks had paperwork. They had paid what they were told were legal fees. They had grieved their own inability to have children and had believed, to the end of their lives, that they had done everything right. They died never knowing that the beautiful dark-haired baby they'd been handed had been taken from another mother's porch in Oregon just weeks before. They were not villains. They were victims too, deceived as thoroughly as the Bennetts were robbed. Vivian Marsh was the villain. And when the Oregon State Police and the FBI pulled the thread, they found she had spent years as exactly the kind of person a small town would never suspect. A respectable, church-going woman who spoke the language of mercy, of finding homes for babies who needed them. That was the mask. Beneath it, investigators came to believe, was a woman who had supplied infants to desperate, paying couples with paperwork that did not bear scrutiny, sourcing children in ways no one had ever looked closely at because no one had ever thought to. Aria Bennett, records now indicate, was not the only child whose adoption traced back to her. When agents located Vivian Marsh in 2025, in her 90s, in a care facility, her fortune and her respectability long since spent, and laid the 1978 photograph of baby Aria in front of her, she said almost nothing. She was charged, though her age and health meant the case would move slowly and might never reach the verdict the families deserved. It didn't matter to Hazel Ridge. When word reached the valley that the Bennett baby was alive, that no stranger on the highway had done it, that a well-dressed woman with a Bible and a briefcase had, the shock ran through the county like cold water. People who had spent 47 years believing a transient had taken Aria now had to reckon with something harder, that the person responsible had been the kind of woman you'd hold the door for. The kind you'd trust with your own children, operating in plain sight behind a reputation for kindness. The older residents who still remembered 1978 gathered in the same diner where the search had been organized and sat in a silence that eventually broke into anger. And investigators made clear that the file was not closing with Aria's name. They were now working backward through every adoption Vivian Marsh had ever facilitated, trying to learn how many other families on both sides of that lie were still out there. Danny Bennett, who had spent 47 years watching his mother search, finally had the answer she had died without. They met on a gray afternoon in Oregon, a brother and a sister who shared a face and had missed each other's entire lives. There was no red boot to trigger a buried memory this time, no flicker of recognition, because Aria had been only 1 year old and remembered nothing at all. She came to it as a grown woman named Diane, mourning the parents in California who had loved her and never known the truth, and grieving all over again for a mother in Oregon she would now never get to meet. Danny brought the box from Ruth's dresser. Inside was the single yellow booty their mother had kept for 47 years, taken out every May and held. When Danny placed it in his sister's hand, she did not recognize it. How could she? But she understood what it was, and what it had meant, and that a woman she'd never know had carried it as a promise for nearly half a century. Together they drove to the cemetery, and Aria Bennett stood for the first time at her mother's grave, and left the booty there in the grass, the way it had once lain in the grass by the gate. Aria Bennett was 1 year old, with dark curls and a habit of kicking off her socks, when someone lifted her out of a shaded playpen and drove her into another life. She grew up loved, in a home that never knew it had been given a stolen child, and she became a whole person, a mother herself now, a grandmother to be. In a story that ran parallel to the one her real family lived, the two of them separated by a lie for 47 years. What was taken from Ruth Bennett can never be returned. She searched for her daughter for more than 4 decades and died 6 years too soon, and no arrest and no reunion can give her back the porch light she left on every night for a child who was alive the whole time. But her daughter is alive. And the search that outlived Ruth reached its end anyway, carried across the finish line by a son who never gave up, and a science his mother had trusted before it could keep its promise. Ruth's DNA, waiting in a database after she was gone, was what finally identified her own child. In a way, she found Aria after all. So we'll leave you with a few things to think about. Diane Merrick lived a happy life with parents who loved her and never knew the truth. So when a stolen child grows up loved, who does she belong to? And can there ever be a clean answer? What do you make of the fact that the people who raised Aria were deceived just as badly as the family who lost her? And how many other children from that era, taken before any national system existed to look for them, are out there tonight, one curious DNA test away from a family that never stopped waiting? Tell us in the comments. If Aria's story moved you, subscribe so you don't miss the next case, and you'll find more solved cold cases waiting in the description. Thank you for watching.